So, you finished your quilt top? Now what? Hi, my name is Fallon and I love to quilt. However, when I say I love to quilt, I am usually thinking about fabric shopping and looking at different quilt patterns, design options, and of course, piecing the quilt top. I have a lot of quilt tops. However, we do need to get our quilt tops finished, don't we? Today, I'm going to be sharing with you a few tips that I have learned along the way that make quilting on a domestic sewing machine a lot less daunting. Now, my first tip for you is to familiarize yourself with your machine and your setup. Now, my machine is a Juki TL18 QVP, but there are so many different machines out there that are perfect for quilting. So I'm going to kind of let you know some of the things I look for on my machine, and a lot of them can be translated to the machine you are using and some may not. But whatever machine you're using, trust me, you will be able to quilt your quilt on it. Just in case you don't believe me, I have a video on my channel that shows me quilting a quilt from start to finish on a machine that I bought from Walmart for just 80 bucks. So trust me, it can be done. I will link to that video in the description of this video. The first thing I like to do on a new machine is to test the stitch length. So if you haven't done that, I would really suggest you get a little mini quilt sandwich that you can stitch some stitches on and find a stitch length that you like a lot for quilting. So on this machine, when I am piecing a quilt, I usually piece it on 2. So let me show you what that looks like. So on my machine, my stitch dial looks like this. This is a very basic quilt machine. It just does straight stitching. So on number 2, I would usually have my 1/4 inch foot in, but I have my walking foot set up because I am quilting. But I'm going to show you what that stitch length looks like. So I'm just going to do some straight stitches through here. You don't have to go far. You can just get enough stitches to see what it looks like and see if you like it. There are my stitches. They're nice and tight together, and this is perfect for piecing my quilt together. But that's not what I want to use for quilting. Now, if you like that for quilting, that's fine. You're looking for the stitch that you like. Oh, and it looks like I went a little farther than 2, but that's okay. I know that's not what I want to use, but let me put it up a little past 2 and see what that looks like. All right, so you see the stitches are getting a little longer, a little farther apart, and we're getting closer to what I prefer for quilting. Now, honestly, I already know what it is on this machine. I know what I like for quilting. But if this were a new machine to you or anything like that, or if you have a machine that has a lot of fancy stitches, this is really fun to do to find a stitch and a stitch length you like to use for quilting. So let me put it up 2 more. And so there we go. It's getting a little wider apart. And the next one I know is going to be where I like to stitch at. So there you go. That is the length that I really like for stitching. I think on my machine, it turns out really nice and it always looks really consistent for me. Now, if I go up a little more, here's how that looks, and it still looks good. You want to look at both sides. I haven't been showing you both sides, but just to make sure your tension and everything is good. And that still looks nice, but this is just the one that I prefer. And again, that's what you're looking for. We're all going to like a different stitch length, and it may depend on your quilt that you're doing as well. So another thing to look at on your machine is if it has any adjustments for the speed that you sew. If not, that is something you could adjust on your own by just not sewing as fast, how far you press your pedal down. On my machine, I can adjust that, and it's something I like to do because I really like to sew fast. And with the Juki walking foot, you really shouldn't be sewing really fast. I'm not sure if that's different with other walking feet, but this one, you really don't want to sew fast. I have broke them before. I'm not joking. I have broke them before and had to get a new one. Another thing to consider with speed isn't just something like how much the walking foot can handle, how fast you're sewing, but how consistent your stitches are going to be. If you're able to quilt your design going at a fast speed, or if you need to kind of slow down and make sure you're stitching where you really want to be. And another thing you can familiarize yourself with on your machine is if there's any other adjustments you can make to make your quilting easier. For example, I have this table attachment that I usually keep on my machine all the time, but maybe your machine didn't come with the table attachment, but there is one that you can purchase for it, and that kind of gives you more area to quilt in, which is really nice. Another adjustment that my machine has is this knob up here, which can raise and lower the presser foot. So if I don't have a walking foot on, I can raise that up a little bit, and when I'm putting a bulky quilt through that, it was really helpful on keeping my stitches nice and consistent and feeding my quilt through nice and even. Another feature on this particular machine that is really handy and is a feature on a lot of other machines is the needle up and down button. So I have my machine set so that when I am finished sewing, so let me show you as an example. So I'm sewing along, and if I stop sewing, my needle stays down. This is really handy because if I need to pivot and sew in another direction, I can keep the needle down, continue sewing, and my stitches stay in line. If I were sewing and my machine didn't stay in the down position, say it stays up, if I didn't put it down and turned, my stitches may be uneven because the needle didn't stay right where I quit stitching at. Now, if your machine doesn't have that feature, don't worry. You normally have a knob on the side of your machine so that you can just crank it and the needle will go down, and then you can pivot if you need to in your quilting. My next tip for you is to gather quilting supplies that you find helpful for quilting. I'm going to tell you a few of the supplies I find really helpful for quilting my quilts on a domestic sewing machine. The first thing I cannot be without when I am quilting is a new needle. I find that needles are so important to have nice and sharp when you are quilting. It gives you a nice, beautiful stitch if that needle is nice and sharp, and putting a new one in is absolute must when I am quilting a quilt. The next thing I have to have is my Gorilla Grip Gloves. I absolutely love these when I'm quilting. You will always see me wearing these. It really helps me feed the fabric through nice and even. The next few supplies I'm going to mention are things that really help me get the design I want onto my quilt. So those things are marked rulers, my straight line quilt lock, some type of marking tool such as some chalk, and then sometimes I do find myself using some masking tape. If you haven't used masking tape before, it is really helpful when you're straight line quilting because you can put the tape down on your quilt and quilt right next to it. Move the tape if you want, and it gives you an even width apart. My third tip for you is to plan the design you want on your quilt ahead of time. I do have a video that shares 5 different easy design ideas for quilting your quilt on a domestic machine, so I will link that down below in the description. For this quilt here, I marked a few lines on this quilt with some chalk. So I marked corner to corner in both directions and stitched along those lines. And then I marked down the middle of the quilt in both directions. And I use those markings to pivot when I am quilting. I often use this design. I really love it But there are so many different ways you can quilt your quilt on a domestic machine, but I really feel like having a plan ahead of time is so helpful. It can be really overwhelming if you sit down and start quilting and no longer can see the full quilt to know how your design is coming together. One of the things I do like to do is do a rough sketch of my quilt design on paper if I don't have a printable already from, say, a pattern that I found or a pattern I designed myself. And then I can sketch some quilting ideas on that and see how it'll come together. So like I said, I did some markings on here and then I've been stitching some lines. Then I use the quilt lock here that has some lines on it to line up with my last set of stitches, and then I can start quilting some more lines. This saves me from having to mark the quilt a ton. Now, if you do like to mark your quilt, I completely understand, because that is a method that will get you really nice, straight, even stitches every time. It gives you something very concrete to follow. But my tip for you with that is to test whatever marking tool you are using on your fabric and make sure it removes completely. Can't tell you how many times I've been burned, even with chalk. Some of the colors of chalk will just stain the quilt, so just test it on your fabric first to make sure that you don't end up heartbroken with lines that don't remove fully. All right, and my final tip for you is to not let your quilt drag. You'll really start to notice this and feel it right away when you're quilting. When I first started, it was really hard for me to feel it on my own, and I wouldn't understand why my needle was bending or why my stitches were getting so tight together, but it's because your quilt's either caught on something like the table or because you're letting it drag down onto your lap or off the table. So that's why you see here, like, I have the quilt lifted up on me, and that's to make sure it's not dragging and it allows me to sew nice and even. So I'm getting up to where I need to pivot this, and like I said, we talked about that earlier, that if the needle is down, it makes it much easier to raise the presser foot and pivot what you are sewing, and the needle will stay in the same spot that you stop sewing so that you can continue sewing. All right, so we kept the needle down, and now we're gonna start sewing in a new direction. Keeping that needle down will keep our stitching nice and even. Now, if you don't like this method that I'm using, which I call it the bunching method, I will bunch my quilt up under the area here, the throat of my machine, and I will keep it bunched up to the side of me. Some people like to roll up their quilts along the sides, and so that's perfectly fine too. Try a few different methods and find what works best for you. Something else that helps a lot if you have a particularly big quilt, because when I'm sewing here, the quilt can start falling off the back of the table. If you have some folding tables and have enough space to put some more tables out so that you can have some beside you or behind your sewing space so that your quilt doesn't drag off the end of the table, that is really helpful too. Here's my quilt all quilted. If you like the way my quilt looks, it is just one charm pack and some background fabric, and I have the full tutorial available on my channel now. You can piece this together in just one weekend. I also gave some diagrams and different tips to help bring this quilt together with ease. You can download the PDF version on my website for just $2.99 if you want, but everything is available in that tutorial on my channel for free. Hopefully you found some of these tips for getting your quilts quilted helpful. Let me know in the comments how many quilt tops you have that need to be quilted. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.